The mood within the troops is always a sign for how well the army is doing. Of course, one always reads in the newspapers of successes at the various fronts. On the radio, smaller battles are exaggerated. And if one watches the weekly news shows, it's ever going forward. Here in training, we have both extremes, and we have to always put this into the right perspective. On one hand, there are the young comrades, the replacements, or the milk faces, who are highly motivated and are quite eager to finally pin decorations onto their uniform jackets. With those, is then, during home leave, able to impress the ladies, and the date is then already within easy reach. We old hands aren't supposed to tell horror stories from the front line, but rather from the years 41 and 42, when we were still rolling toward the east, and were literally sweeping away Ivan. Then, we also have a few men who, without any large emotional commitment, are simply doing their job, and who hardly give it any or little thought. I like those the best. They will do what they're supposed to, and will, according to my humble opinion, also function at the front. The most difficult are the old veterans. One can't fool them anymore. Within the training facilities are several who have really put a lot behind them. Of course, they'll always put on a happy face, but I believe they'd also be glad if the time of fighting was over. But here, no one expresses his own opinion about the war and the withdrawals of the past few months, though we get news of it more since the connections to the fighting troops still exist. We also have to train infantry soldiers or armored reconnaissance men who are now to be trained as tank soldiers. Sometimes I think that the average foot soldier is imagining to survive the war inside the tank for longer than outside of it. I believe, however, that if it's meant to happen, one can't do anything about it. Training, despite all, is going well, and we succeed in conveying the necessary groundwork to the comrades. I can also sense that one can get used to this life behind the front. The food is good, I've already packed on a few kilograms. Also able to drive to Gudrun and Mareike once in a while, even if the train connections are becoming worse all the time and trains are being cancelled. Meanwhile, Peter was briefly here. We talked once again about the reassignment to his unit, and he's going to try to make something possible. Apparently, he's acquainted with my training leader, and has talked to him. When he departed to return back to his men, he promised me, in my hand, that he'd get back to me at the beginning of March. The 1st Regiment was still stationed in France. It's trained there, or rather retrained. Now would actually be the right time to relocate there. They had long-barreled Panzer IVs and also a few Panthers, tells Peter. So, a powerful unit, which is certainly soon going back to the east again. I've received 2 new men, both of them tank men, who'd already spent their entire year of 33 in the east. Helmut, a lance corporal from Bavaria, was a loader in a Panzer III. He's also made a few painful experiences with burning tanks. He tells us about his last battle in the east. His platoon had made an attack on a unit of T-34s, whom they were supposed to engage in the flank. They had snuck close through a patch of woods, and soon they'd reached the point where the enemy vehicles were supposed to pass. They'd gone into well-camouflaged positions with 8 tanks and several armored personnel carriers, when after a few hours, the enemy engines could be heard. The terrain went downhill. The tank main guns were supposed to be effective to the north. The direction of advance of the enemy unit was to the west, and with that, it should have been easy to drive a wedge into the tank convoy and to disperse the Russians, or to annihilate them. The command to fire came. It had hit the enemy vehicles hard. 3 enemy tanks were knocked out immediately. The remainder probably had damages. But the T-34s had quickly turned and opened fire into the edge of the woods themselves. The element of surprise had vanished. and now it was going tank against tank. Only the Panzer IVs, with their 75mm, had been effective against the Russian tanks. Therefore, it was ordered to withdraw the Panzer IIIs and to engage the supply unit of the enemy. In a small encirclement, they had, together with 2 APCs, gone around to reach the alleged tail end of the convoy. Apparently, the commanders were suffering buck fever and were eager to finally dish out some paybacks. But the rough awakening was soon to come. The Russians hadn't fallen for it, and had quickly set up a front line of anti-tank guns. Thus, Helmut, together with his comrades, were driving straight into anti-tank gun emplacements. The Russian anti-tank guns immediately knocked out one of the tanks and rendered the APCs immobilized. Infantry soldiers went into position and attempted to eliminate the anti-tank gun crews, but the distance was too great. The remaining tanks were driving, firing, driving again, and were again shooting, but the open plain hardly offered any cover. When Helmut's tank got hit, there was considerable clattering, followed by screams. The tank engine was off, and smoke was wafting through the combat compartment. However, no one seemed to be injured. The engine was able to be started up again. The firefight against the anti-tank guns continued. Then came the next hit, which shook the entire tank. The radio operator shouted "Fire!" and the order to bail out came. The gunner had still tried to reach down to help the driver, but he was already dead, since the enemy shell had penetrated the frontal armor and his upper body. Now the gunner noticed that his foot was injured, as he was squeezing himself out of the turret. The commander was unconscious. The fire was spreading. Then there had been a bang once again, and now it was over. The tank was already burning badly. Now it was a matter of seconds. The radio operator had climbed onto the turret and pulled out the commander. Helmut was pushing from below, while the flames were already grabbing his own legs. When he finally made it out, he was already in flames, and let himself drop from the tank. The radio operator then extinguished Helmut's uniform, as well as he was able to do. But it wasn't over yet. They needed to get away. Helmut grabbed the commander. The gunner, with the injured foot, was hanging onto the radio operator. Meanwhile, all 3 tanks had been eliminated. Now, they somehow had to get away from there. Helmut was looking to his right at his comrades, when in that moment a shell impacted. After the smoke had cleared, there was nothing left of the radio operator and the gunner. The commander came back around, also had a few injuries, but was able to run. The burned uniform was hanging off Helmut's limbs, but together they managed to get out of the fire sector of the anti-tank guns. In a ditch, they rested, and the remaining men from the APC also came running to find cover. Already, wheeled vehicles of the Russians were in sight, which certainly would have wanted to snatch the crews. Therefore, they needed to get further back. Bursts of machine gun fire were whistling over their heads, and the infantry fire broke out. Ever further, they ran across the fields, which offered little cover. 2 of their men had suffered fatal shots and fallen. That's it then, Helmut thought to himself. They had managed to get themselves into a small stand of young trees and waited for the end. Only 2 more infantry soldiers were there, 2, both with a carabiner. They had nothing else. Then they could hear tank engines and hoped they were their own. Indeed, a German tank was breaking through the woods and was firing at the Russians, who were quick to withdraw. More or less severely wounded, it was now going back to their own lines with the tank. Helmut had been badly burned on his legs, had suffered a shot in the shoulder and broken several ribs. He hadn't even noticed it at all. The will to survive had masked the pain. Now, he was here with us, since, with a shattered shoulder, he's no longer able to load a tank grenade. So now he's an assistant instructor and assigned to our bunch. Yes, if one hears it like this, one can relate. One has suffered enough himself, and I can empathize with the pain and also the helplessness to be at the enemy's mercy. Regardless, he's a jolly fellow, and we get along well right from the start. The second in our round is Kurt. He was a radio operator in a Panzer IV, and, in his own view, a master with the bow machine gun. I had never heard of that. Kurt got a downright hatred for the Red Army soldiers, since he'd been shot down 3 times already, and again lost his friends and comrades. With this hatred for the enemy, he turned into a true killing machine at the bow machine gun. He shot up everything that he could get into his sights. Even the wounded didn't matter to him. Everything had to be eliminated. I listened to all of that intently to form my own opinion. There's most likely more to it. I believe he probably has experienced more things to become this way. At some point then, he does disclose it. After the battle, he had a few wounded Russian soldiers who had surrendered. They were of course spared, just remained where they were. These days, apparently, no one looked really closely for weapons or other items among the Reds. Then, as his crew was standing in front of the tank, one of the injured Russians opened fire and mowed down the entire troop. He was the only one who had survived, probably because his commander, who was standing right in front of him, had taken most of the bullets. After that, I believe, he no longer made any prisoners. Yes, war does change a person. I don't want to say that I understand it, but now at least I know his reasons. Months later, he then also suffered a bullet to the head, and since then, he's no longer fit for the frontline duty. Because of that, he's now also with us. Well, let's see whether we can keep him busy here. So it will work out for all of us. Time here passes by rather quickly, and I must say that I'm enjoying training. One is able to relate some knowledge and has the correct answers to many questions. My Master Sergeant is also a fine man, and together we've already had to sacrifice one or the other bottle of high-quality liquor for the fatherland. I'm very excited about what will happen to me now. By now, I could also live with the idea of being a loader. The main thing is being back inside the tank turret. My training leader has to listen to this coming from me almost every week. But he's also understanding of me. But he also admonishes I have had a lot of luck so far, and during the next frontline deployments, things could get tight. Here, we also talk about the progressive development of weapons. Most of all, the enemy tanks and anti-tank guns. With the Tiger and the Panther, however, we had a sharp sword, which was always needed on the battlefield. Also, the tank destroyers had become an important part at the front line. But who knows how many tanks the Russians are still going to produce? At some point, it has to come to an end as well. During my last visit home, Gudrun is, despite the poor situation of the civilian population, in good spirits. Once again, I talk about Peter, and want a frontline deployment again. He then only asks whether that was at all possible with my eyes. That will work out alright, I explained to her. Despite all, she's worried about me, because there were more than enough war widows already, and I was supposed to watch my daughter grow up. Of course, I understand her reservations, but I just can't get out of my own skin. I'm a tanker. That's what I want to do. Besides, someone has to stop the Russian tanks. Now, I can only wait for Peter, and for what may come for myself and my further planning.